Star Wars Nia here with another episode of the Star Wars podcast. And today's episode is about the meaning of Star Wars, I guess you could put it. I don't know how, what are the banners saying. I'm going to make a couple historical comparisons, and this is all dealing with the subject of Star Wars and might get a little deep and whatnot. But one of the first things people thought of when the original Star Wars movie came out, I guess, was hope. I mean, that it wasn't called this at the time, but the movie became known, and its title became A New Hope. So this whole magical idea of the Force and this whole grand universe. But there's one other thing that goes along with it: the 1970s. If you don't know the 1970s, it comes after the 1960s. The 1960s in America was a domestically terrible time where civil rights issues were being taken up, and 1968 just culminated all this domestic tension. And then in 1968, that's the election year, Richard Nixon. Sorry, I got confused. Ronald Reagan's in the 80s. Anyways, Richard Nixon becomes president of the United States. And then in the early 70s, after Richard Nixon's second election, there's this whole scandal, Watergate, and Gerald Ford ended up becoming president after Richard Nixon and his VP both uh, resign. And then we also have all the OPEC stuff going on top of this. The point I'm trying to make is at this time, America was in a terribly, terribly low situation. And by low, I mean our country was not that hopeful. I mean, Jimmy Carter was elected on the idea of hope in a manner of speaking. He was kind of looked up as a grandfatherly type figure in 1976, someone who could cushion it, and that's why this guy was elected. And then terrible things happened then while he was president with that Iran crisis and whatnot. My point being is Star Wars, in the midst of all this crisis, is a beacon of hope to the people during that time period, is probably also part of the success of Star Wars. Now let's go look at the prequel trilogy and what was happening then. Well, really, there wasn't much that happened during the prequel trilogy. Now, especially when the original Star Wars movie came out. Now, by the time episodes 2 and 3 came out, 9/11, Afghanistan War, and the Iraq War had both occurred. But, other movies came along more immediately to take their place, and by then, The Phantom Menace had already been put down as a bad movie, making the other movies not look as good, and they never held to the same caliber. And in 1999, when The Phantom Menace came out, the worst thing that had happened in even that decade was probably the Persian Gulf War, which was an easy one for the US. There wasn't much political or domestic strife in the 90s to make these movies have the connection the original Star Wars movies did. So that's probably part of the reason these movies never became as significant as the original trilogy. Now, let's go look at the sequel trilogy, which is the only movie part of the sequel trilogy that has come out is The Force Awakens. In these past couple months, we have seen the shootings in California. There was a shooting in Charleston apparently earlier that I forgot about. There was the shootings in France in early November. We've had terrible foreign strife in the Middle East and power struggles with Russia. Uh, our our country is in a bad domestic position, and it's been piling on top of these issues that have been piling on top of each other for the past decade or so. These issues are things that are being wrung out of the issues that were brought out of the early 2000s from 9/11, the Iraq War, just like the issues in the 1970s. They weren't necessarily on top of those 1960 issues, but they just expanded on that strife and didn't help the situation any. The 2008 economic crisis, all this stuff is being hitting our nation over and over and over. But Disney, in the past year or so, has been really hyping up this new Star Wars movie. And I think when it came out, it has reignited this passion for Star Wars, but not only that, this hope of the Star Wars universe and the hope that things get better. And that's what Star Wars represents for people. It doesn't represent, it's a struggle versus evil and good, making its way into a more clear situation in a time where people don't have the ability to see the clarity in their own lives and what's going on in the world. They don't have the ability to see that the world is in a good spot. And the Star Wars movies have always brought this bigger, broader aspect. I mean, you still see these characters struggle, but you know what side they're on more or less. You know that Darth Vader is a villain, whereas Anakin Skywalker is a good guy. Until he turns to the dark side at the end of episode 3. The changes in the characters are at least apparent, but you know that things can change because Darth Vader then ends up becoming the good guy at the end of episode 6. There's that hope that things will change. I mean, in the 80s, things get a lot better. Economic situation is lessened after the OPEC crisis is over. And right now, our economy is slowly improving, but it still feels dragged down from 2008. And people still need to know what's going on. And Star Wars has always been this central hope and way for people to understand and express themselves in a way that they feel isn't going to bring them any problems. That's why Star Wars has not only been such a good thing for people have in their lives, but and it's always been a world larger than itself. And it would have been that if it wasn't released at the right time. But both 1977 and 2015 were the right times for these movies to be released. And if you look at what's happening, I think the rest of the sequel trilogy is going to end up being held up to the same standards as the original trilogy. And I think that's because this is all fighting the same fight in a manner of speaking. And I would hope that by the time the rest of the sequel trilogy is out, our world's in a lot better place than when 20 the 2015 Force Awakens came out. Because if you look at both Star Wars movies, both of them had crowds going to their movies. You can't deny it. Star Wars, the original Star Wars, is the number 2 movie when adjusted for inflation. Our Star Wars now is now about to or has beaten Avatar in box office sales for the number 1 movie ever, not adjusted for inflation. because it's gotten crowds and crowds of people coming to these movies. It's not that these movies were not great in themselves, but they are also needed in our culture and society. And I love them. I think they're wonderful, but I also have to appreciate them for what they have done. And these movies mean something to people. They mean something to people in a way that not everyone's able to understand. And if you are still listening, you probably think I'm somewhat crazy. But at the same time, you have to know what I'm saying is somewhat true. As Star Wars, in a way, is a part of all our lives and the same struggle we're all having. We're all trying to find that balance in the world, just like Star Wars is trying to find the balance into what into how their universe should be. So, anyways, uh, I think that's what Star Wars means, and it shows and is helping us understand our universe in a manner of speaking. And the prequel trilogy, though it may not have come at the right time, Lucas was also trying to say something when he made those movies. If you look at those movies, you see some political strife. And just because those movies didn't necessarily come at a time where our country was domestically hurting, he was still trying to make the point that our politics were still hurting and that our country's government was still hurting and needed to be fixed through because of things such as corruption, which we have seen increase in recent years. So I would say go rewatch those movies in a new light, and maybe they'll have different meaning now than they did then. But all of the movies, all Star Wars movies, are great for what they are. And think about the not only the effects Star Wars movie has had on you, but go back and think, okay, back in the 70s when this movie came out, what was going on then? What was going on in 83? Well, things had gotten better. The Iran crisis was over, the economy was improving, and think 4 years from now, hopefully things will be that way. Maybe the Middle East won't be so bad 4 years, and they will have figured things out, and the economy will have gotten better. And the Star Wars movies will have taken that journey along with us. Whatever the problems that started out in the sequel trilogy in The Force Awakens will be solved by the end in 2019. So maybe our society is just taking the same ride as Star Wars. So, this is Star Wars Indiana. If you have any suggestions for future videos, put it in the comments below. And thanks for listening.